am Bronwyn Williams. You're back with the small print, and today again my guest is Wandile Sihlobo. So Wandile, please tell us a bit about yourself. As you know, on this show we like to get our guests to introduce themselves the way they want to be introduced.
That's always a tough task. Thanks for having me on, firstly, Bron, on the podcast again. My name is Wandile Sihlobo. I'm an agricultural economist based at the Agricultural Business Chamber of South Africa, and also affiliated with the Department of Agricultural Economics at Stellenbosch University. I do a bit of work, both government and the private sector. So I'm in that intersection of policy and business.
Great. And you are back on our show because you've got another book in circulation, A Tale of Two Agricultures, which is, of course, touching on some of the pertinent issues around our country. In fact, unfortunately, some of the really important issues that don't get enough airtime and space because our news headlines and general consciousness tends to be filled up with things that are breaking and the things that are urgent, right? So we constantly know what's going on with electricity and what's going on with the economy and what's going on with the rand. And we hear these stories all the time, but they're really symptoms of more the nominal side or the monetary side of the economy and less so to do with the real and good side of the economy. And agriculture obviously sits right at the bottom of that tower of necessity when it comes to human needs. There's not much that we need more than food and agriculture, other than perhaps water, which maybe we can talk about another time. But today we'll stick with the food equation. And maybe you could start with just telling us why you decided to write this book and why you decided to write it now.
Yeah, I think you 100% correct in your narration of the environment at which we find ourselves in. We talk a lot about the near-term issues, but there are some structural things that are important we should be focusing on. I mean, I decided to write the book at the moment for a number of reasons. And I think one of those reasons that one can highlight is the fact that we are a country where we're still looking for sources of growth to say what can actually keep us going as a country. And agriculture is one of the sectors that has the potential to still grow. I mean, the numbers we have run on our side, we think the gross value added of agriculture could still expand by anything between 15% to 30% over the next decade. But it was also important for me that I bring the agriculture into the conversation because we've talked a lot about the land, which is an important component of that. But the more economically active stuff that we needed to pay attention on was to say, what can we do then to get value out of the agricultural side? And I would say the second layer of that reason is the fact that we still have an agricultural sector that is dualistic, as has been the case over time. And I was looking back to say, we are now approaching 30 years in democracy. It is perhaps maybe important to say, where are we as South Africa in as far as the general growth of agriculture, but also on a transformation dynamics, how many of the Black farmers that are actually in the commercial space? And when we looked at those numbers, they remain disappointing. I think Black farmers are making anything around about on average 10% on the commercial output. But it's not one thing to say, okay, they are not there. You have to think about the reasons why the participation is minimal, and more so, and paid a lot of attention on saying going forward, what are some of the things that we should be implementing? And the book paid a lot of attention on that. And I will close this point and say, I then had to make sure that the book is written in rather more narrative style than the dry academic take, because at the end of the day, you're putting it on and you want South Africans to have a conversation and reflect on some of this reality, as well as a proposal that the book is putting forward. So it had also to be less boring in as much as it hopefully offers some of the solutions.
Yes, I wanted to touch on essentially three subjects today. Thank you very much for that introduction. You've covered a lot of ground there, but let's take it step by step and look at the three sort of aspects I wanted to look at. The first aspect we can look at is the growth opportunity that you alluded to, because we have rather scarce pickings for growth opportunities in our particular economy and even in our global economy. There's obviously threats of things like recession. And of course, not many economists or political analysts have particularly rosy views of the South African local context either. So let's touch on that. Let's look at why agriculture is a source of growth. But then for the second thing, obviously, we want to look at the inequalities within our agricultural system, which, as you talked about, that's the title of your book. Literally, it is this whole tale of two agricultures. So we can go into that a little bit too. But then there was also a third angle that you touched on your book, but I wanted to unpack it. In fact, we can start with that before we go back to the core content of your latest piece of work. And that is the necessity of agriculture and food security. Because I obviously work in the futures space. I'm doing some work with the UNDP at the moment. And when it comes to food security, this is an emerging threat at a global level, whether you're looking at things like home shoring or homeland economics or friendshoring, this idea of a fractured, fragmented world, and this necessity to secure food security for your own people. And I think in the South African context, that's even more critical, this idea of actually securing food. We already took electricity and water for granted, and those are falling away. But energy and water that comes from the state in a tap is nice, and it's a nice to have, but food you kind of have to have, and that's not something that people can make alternative provisions for themselves. And we see that in the latest really shocking data when it comes to actual food security, revealed food security within our communities, when we're seeing the horrific statistics that say that 1 in 4 children in South Africa are stunted at the moment. So in other words, we're not actually delivering on food security, although as you go into great detail in your book, we have a lot of natural advantages when it comes to being a place that should be food secure. So maybe you want to comment on that to start before we get into more of your actual work and your actual thesis, and this idea of the necessity and the failure that we've had to actually capitalize on our own market for our own domestic usage. Forget about the export market for a second now. But what's gone wrong in terms of securing food for our own people? And I know many people have quite a different perspective on economics and political values to myself, are saying that that is a failure of South African policy, that we have focused too much on exports and not enough on feeding our own people. So what are your thoughts around agriculture at a domestic level before we go into the rest of your book?
No, and I think that's very important, Bron, because South Africans have been talking a lot about that, and the conversation usually intensifies around the World Food Day, 16th of October, where people start to looking at this. But I would comment on it in two ways. The first layer being that at a national level, we are solidly food secure. We've done well. I mean, we can pat ourselves at the back as a country to say, thinking back in 1994 up until to today, the country's growth of agricultural sector, volume and value, has more than doubled. So there's a lot of improvement that has been done on that. And there's a number of things behind it. It is on part, the one that you were referring to earlier, the fact that there's an export angle on it. So there is that demand approach that is pulling and supply, and farmers are producing a lot to fill that gap. But the second part, it has a lot to do with improvement in productivity. That is the farmers' efforts, but also the South African government's openness to register all kinds of seeds and agrochemicals that we needed to boost the productivity as a semi-arid country. And that makes us then to say at a national level, we are fine. I mean, you look at various indices, take, for example, the Economist Global Food Security Index. It has its faults in methodology and everything else, but it is still one of the useful indexes to look at and say, where are we sitting? They measure about 113 countries there. And South Africa in 2022 was at about 59 point out of that 113 countries, having improved from being at number 70 in the previous year. So there is an improvement at a national level. And they consider all important aspects of food security, availability, safety, affordability, and all of that. But where the crux of the issue is at, which is where you hit the nail on the head as you are laying out the foundation on this point, is the fact that, I mean, at a household level in South Africa, we have a huge problem. I mean, over 6 million South Africans, that's this data, the data that the SSA guys are putting out, are food insecure, which means some of them, they go to bed without food, proper meals. And of course, then that means that we have to do something at a household level. The question then becomes to say, is that a farming question or is that a broad socio-economic question? And I think in as far as farming and producing and making sure there is supply, there is a success in that. And there is a success on having efficient value chains of distributing, because in South Africa, you can be in Bizana, you can be in Modimoli, in Limpopo, or somewhere in the Northern Cape, you still find all of the things that you need fresh in all of the retailers, which means that the value chains do work. But then the question is on saying why then many people are still sitting in these painful conditions that they are in. And that has a lot then to do with the issue of employment. And regardless of how you can drop a price from an X amount of rand to to whatever price that you want to call, if there is no income, there is no income in these households. And I think which is why then for me, I was saying, look, we know that not all South Africans were fortunate to get good education. They're not going to be absorbed in all of the countries. And we are not trying to say people should be backward and only focusing on agriculture. Agriculture is no longer what many people maybe know decades ago now. It is also industrializing, benefiting from technology, and there's better ways of actually operating going forward. But the point is, it can still absorb as many South Africans with less skills as possible. Once they are there, then we have to be thinking about how do they get upskilled so that as the world progresses and the agricultural operations changes and benefiting from technological advancement, they are able to be absorbed in other parts of the value chains. For me, that's the most important thing. That's the income poverty problem that is there in South Africa. And I think that agriculture, specifically in about 3 provinces that rank highly when you think about poverty in the country, that's the Eastern Cape, Limpopo, KZN. There's still opportunities there to grow agriculture. And I still think that then maximizing those opens up a room for income in these households. And then we begin to address the household food security issue, in addition to gardenings and the other things that can be made.
So thank you for making that point so clearly. We do not have a food security problem here in South Africa. In fact, we have a food security opportunity. We do have a poverty problem. And one of the statements that was in actually one of your bullets, the lists in your book that really stood out for me was you made the point that when it comes to addressing poverty, that agriculture has a higher return on investment than other investments in other industries in an economy. Can you elaborate on that point a bit? Because obviously there was some other detail that went with it, that those gains and that return on investment in agriculture is greatest in poorer and lagging behind economies, which does speak directly to the South African context and does frame agriculture as a great opportunity for fixing many of those fundamental problems that you've covered so eloquently.
No, that's good, correct, Bronwyn. Thanks for raising that point, because at the end of the day, it's about when you are getting to the poorest communities of the Eastern Cape, you are in Port St. John's or you are somewhere in the Southern KZN. The idea then there is to say, with all of those people that are sitting there, what natural resource that they really have at which they can be able to do something with least amount of investments that can be put in place in those areas. And I think this is where then the agricultural story begins to come into place. And I think in addition to that, this ease of labor absorption compared to other sectors where you still need a much more rigorous training. And we know that South Africans, majority in a number of towns, are not as fortunate to have that proper training. And so those are all of the dynamics that then were there to say, if you were to resolve that and you have that improvement in agricultural production and many people are employed, and of course then food prices starting to come down in some of those regional value chains, then you begin to deal with that problem of hunger much more head on, compared to saying, look, we're about to put on an investment where we'll need XYZ skills in this area. We have to be training these people for a period of about 10 years, which is all very important for human development. But the problem is people are hungry today. And we have to be thinking of saying, let's do the agriculture story, but we're not only focusing on agriculture as a nation. There are other developments that we'll be making in other sectors of the economy. But this is a good starting point for certain geographies in South Africa. And as you rightly put it, there is evidence that there are much more better gains that we do get of agriculture in dealing with poverty and unemployment situation. And in fact, I mean, the NDP laid it out nicely as far back as 2012, where they were saying, look, we can have as million people more in agriculture and agro-processing. And when they thought about those value chains, they laid nicely in the areas with high unemployment in South Africa, the very three provinces that I was mentioning, which is why then I was thinking, if the politicians, premiers in those provinces, they spend more time thinking about the investment opportunities in those provinces and how they can bring in agribusinesses and how they can deal with all of the other barriers that are there, which we will discuss, into production. And then that can begin to be something that is tangible and people can actually see those gains and see those improvements in their communities.
Absolutely. But those gains are all precluded by the fact that that means that we have to get our informal or previously disadvantaged sectors of our agricultural economy up to par with the previously over-advantaged, if you want to put it that way, sectors of our economy. And of course, this is a global challenge. Of course, South Africa is the poster boy of inequality and gross inequality at that. But at the agricultural sector at a global level, we do see gross inequalities between very large multinational monopolies compared to independent and subsistence, or even just small scale farmers that really struggle to compete in this very monopolistic, very intellectual property backed global market, because that's the sort of unspoken elephant in the agricultural room. We've got at the moment very big multinationals trying to sell patented seeds to African farmers, for example. And this is never mind local inequality. Now we're talking about international inequality, where farmers don't even have possession over the future gains of their own crops that they plant, because seed violations can get you thrown into jail. That's just one of the sort of trending stories at the moment. But agriculture at scale, whether you're talking about chicken farming, whether you're talking about cash crops, whatever you're talking about, there are a lot of sort of monopoly barriers to trade that really do favor the largest players. And again, this is a global issue. It's not just a local one, but at our local level, we've got extra layers of historical inequality, of historical subsidies, historical land ownership patterns that we have to contend to, that just makes small scale farming even more challenging to get up to an even playing field. So I know this is a huge problem, and it's not a problem that we can solve in a 40-minute conversation on the internet on like a Friday afternoon. Let's be honest here. But your book does go into quite a lot of detail in articulating that inequality and that unequal playing field problem in the South African context, and then also giving some suggestions as to how we can close that gap and destroy or reduce some of those really inequitable, essentially state and law funded and protected anti-competitive moats. So just to sort of rephrase that question, how can we make our agricultural sector more fair? How can we close the gap between the two agricultures? And how do we make that a more even playing field going forward without reducing our international competitiveness? Because that's always, of course, the sort of the catch that many people who want to protect monopoly interests would want to fall back on. So I know that's a large question, but that is basically the thesis of your book. So over to you.
Bron, but I want to pick up on one of the points that you make about the multinational before getting into the question, because I do think that, Bron, as much as there are a couple of discomforts about the ownership and the patterns of seeds and certain agrochemicals that we use, but I mean, the reality is those businesses, yes, they are structured the way that they are, but that also gives them enough capital muscle to do impressive research that has been of great benefit. I mean, I'm just thinking now about South Africa, and this is a point that is in the book, in a sense that if you think about year 2000 and the years before that, before we adopted genetically modified seeds and everything else, our yields in crops were somewhere on maize about 2 tons per hectare. Today, we are over 6 tons per hectare on rain-fed in much of the area. So there are productivity gains on that. And I think each country can figure out a way of how to administer all of that so that they're not in the losing end of it. So it is a really much of a social good, because now as the area planting declines, we need to be thinking about improving productivity, because I'm also wary of not using the technology to boost productivity, because it's what is happening in Africa now that is worrying me. If you think about grains across the African continent, with the exception of South Africa and Zambia, the improvement in yields that we have, improvement in overall harvest that we've seen from the early 2000s up until to 2020, it's largely been people tilling new land, taking off forests and growing more stuff, instead of actually say, how can we grow in a limited area and have the trees and the forests and everything thrive, and then really boost the yields on that. And I think that's what we need to be doing, and then find out a way of nicely operating with all of these multinational, which I think South Africa is getting it in a fairly good position at this point. But to the question of saying, look, how do we deal then with the dualism that is there? And I think in South Africa, we were just about 2 or 3 weeks ago, I was with my colleagues at Department of Agricultural Economics at Stellenbosch University, discussing the whole thing of the book to say, look, can South Africa really at some point be a country where we don't have smallholder farmers and we only have one agriculture, which is commercial, and then the dualism will be closed? And as best as we can tell at the point, and I still hold this view, it will be very difficult to actually have only the commercial. South Africa will remain with a somewhat dualistic structure of agriculture for some time. But the problem with its current structure at the moment, exactly as you hit on it in your point, is the fact that it is also racially divided. You have a situation where it's white farmers that are largely commercial and black farmers are sitting on the smallholder farming side. So in the political economic context, and considering the history of South Africa, that is not boding well. The idea then that we have at the moment is to say, how do you develop a new class of commercial black farmers, while at the same time there are support systems for smallholder farmers, for local value chains and communities where you cannot really do commercial, because we cannot force everybody to say everybody should be going in the large scale farming. And commercial, again, is not only the land size, it has a lot to do with about what do you do with the produce once you have produced that. And I think in a South African sense, there's a number of things that need to be done. The first one, we do need to deal with the land governance. And the people that didn't listen to our past conversation, I mean, it's here in your channel, they can find that out where we discuss at length about the land issues. But it is one of the prerequisites that is important, because as we speak, the South African government is sitting with large portions of land, and they have now earmarked about 2.5 million hectares of land, of saying, we need to really release this with title deeds to new farmers. And the mode of operation now is what in the book I call better few, but better, which means we have to be selecting really better commercial farmers in a certain criteria that we're putting in place for the release of the land, while supporting smallholder and the medium scale farm. And then at the same time, in addition to that, you do need to deal with agricultural finance. Blended finance systems, strengthening the land bank, and all kinds of instruments are necessary. But there are other things that are cross-cutting and outside agriculture, which have to do with infrastructure, municipalities that are operating well, because water, electricity, roads are related to that. There are some that do not require financing. The Department of Agriculture has its own inefficiencies in regulations. Either it's for registering seeds, registering agrochemicals, making sure there are labs that are good for grading our meat for exports, all these kinds of things. These are aspects that needs to actually be put in place for us to be able to have that new class of the commercial black farmers. And I think the policy has to be deliberate in doing that, while at the same time supporting everybody else. And I think in that context, we could be able then to deal with this inequality that is racialized in the case of South Africa. And it is a prolonged process, capital intensive, which is why also the rule of law and financing needs to be in place, and be less radical about it, by more methodological about how we should be doing this.
Yeah, that's a really good point. But what can we do in terms of getting people ready to take on this challenge? This has always been the gap, because this is one of the great problems that we have in South Africa, is that we have a large and willing labor pool, but we don't necessarily have the right skills match to the people who are ready and willing and wanting to take on these challenges. And this has been the criticism of a lot of the more sort of state-led projects, particularly in the agricultural sector, where projects have been started either by communities or by individuals, and they've not necessarily succeeded to the level that they should. Now, you touched on a few points there with regards to the sort of support they need in terms of finance, in terms of capital, but there's also the skills question. And I've certainly sat in on various different agricultural conferences over the years where this idea of skills sharing from the old, previously advantaged sector of the market towards the new aspirational side of the market, there seems to be a disconnect in actually handing over and sharing those skills, which is not asking for money per se, but rather a more cohesive community when it comes to looking at agriculture going forward in a less us versus them kind of basis, and a more we all kind of need to work together if we want our country and our economy to succeed. What are your thoughts there with regards to the skills rather than the money side of the gap closing?
I mean, you are right, because you can pour the money. If there is no skill, nothing will actually happen. But Bron, what is good at the moment is also the fact that I mean, in the book, we highlight a couple of examples like the Sonic Group, which is the beef entity farming with Bonsmara in a free state. There are some like the Karan beef is also having certain model. Pals in the Western Cape in Ceres, they do something. But all of those are more like incubation houses where they are saying, look, let's bring in smallholder and people that are really outside of agriculture to go through an incubation period so that they are able to learn the skill. But they, in addition to that, they are linked to the value chain players that are there, because infrastructure is in two things. There's a physical infrastructure, but there's also soft infrastructure, institutions, networks that farmers need to have, and all of those things. And those incubation platforms, they close that gap. But for you then to get into that incubation, you also need to have a better criteria of saying, how do you select people that will be beneficiaries of the piece of land? We know from the work of Ruth Hall, Tembeka Kepe, and the others that in the past, it was largely Black men that have political connections that were actually on the upper end of the beneficiary. But right now, then how do you begin to favor young people that are really ambitious and they will do something economically active with the land, as well as women in that? Because I mean, as we said in one of our past conversations, when you're dealing with the land reform and this agricultural journey, you are, yes, dealing with restorative justice question, but more so also the economic question, given the inequality point that we have been discussing, poverty, low growth, unemployment. So they need to respond to that. So the training and the incubation is one of the rigorous one. And in South Africa, we're also fortunate because there are various commodity associations, Grain SA, Potato SA, Fruit SA, Citrus Growers Association, and many others. All of these have what we call developmental goal, where they are training young people and involving them into, and those are the people that need to actually be at the top of the line when we are thinking about who should be benefiting, because they are skilled and they will be able to do some of these activities that are economically driven and uplift societies and everything else. So I think for me, that's where the focus in the selection of a beneficiary should be in, and there should be a lot more focus on that. And I am very glad you raised it, because this is also one of the challenges that you have, because if you look in the former homelands of South Africa, yes, they're usually in the periphery of agricultural progress for reasons related to tenure securities, infrastructure, hard infrastructure. But there's also there a challenge that there is no soft infrastructure. Institutions are not there. Organized agriculture is not there. So for those folks in those areas, it is very hard for them to be absorbed into some of these training facilities, which again is a point of saying not only should the government be doing something, but commodity associations should be looking at some of these areas that could be potential regions for expansion and begin to say, how do we get to have agronomists, extensionists that are actually training some of the people that could potentially be part of their members and part of the farming class on that. And I think that's an important thing that the colleagues have to be thinking about. And some are already doing it in some regions. Yeah.
Yeah, I think what you're really getting at there is that we need to have a bit more alignment across all the various different stakeholders here, around various sectors of the private sector, around the state, around academia, around associations. What is your perspective as an expert in this space with regards to collaboration across all the critical stakeholders required to both close the divide between our actual and potential and between the advantaged and less advantaged parts of our economy, to then work together to, as we'll get into the next part of the conversation, actually take advantage of the growth opportunity ahead? Are people working together enough, or is there an appetite to work together, or what are the barriers that you are seeing when it comes to real collaboration across all those different stakeholders?
You know, Brian, the readers will be excited, maybe, I hope. There's a chapter in the book about the political economy, of
Yes.
South Africa's agriculture. And it hits exactly on that to say, because many people usually hear of certain organizations, farmer associations, and all of that, and they may be asking themselves, how do these interface and how are they grouped like? And that chapter of the political economy speaks to that, because there are some of the politics that we do have in organized agriculture, which in some cases, they actually prove to be unhelpful in thinking about how to formulate a private sector unanimous view that can drive a one point on policy to say policymakers will need X, Y, Z. And then the government can look at that and see this divide, and then they get to decide on who to listen to. But if we had a much more coherent voice, they would better listen to us on that. But at the same time, as I say that, there's been some improvements over the past few years, because we have on the table now what we call the Agriculture and Agro-Processing Master Plan. And I know South Africans I mean, they're fed up of hearing about master plans. Everyone, I mean, I was talking to Peter Bruce, and I was like, master plan? He's like, no, Wandile, don't tell me about master plans. Now, the thing is, with the agriculture one, it is useful in a sense that it was co-created by labor, by business, academia, and as well as government and the other social partners, to an extent that we still think that it is the best possible document. Now, to your point about are people working together, and I think in the Agriculture and the Agro-Processing Master Plan, launched in May 2022, it captures the aspirations of the sector in a much more better way now, and a serious improvement from the NDP, which was very useful, but at a high level. Here, with more detail of the value chains, what channels should we be following? What should we be doing in what regions? So for me, I do think that the conversation has improved. And I will anchor again to say protecting the property rights and making sure that we transfer land rights to new entrance farmers as we implement the master plan will be something that will be fundamental in the process. So the conversation is getting there, Bron, into having everyone on the table. At least the master plan mirrors that.
Yeah, I think that was another interesting point, just as an aside, before we get on to the growth and opportunity, sticking with the whole optimism thing, is that your advice in the book is less about expropriation from the previously advantaged and more towards giving more rights and more ownership to the less advantaged strata of our economy. In that, as you mentioned in the book, quite a lot of the land that is currently being used by smaller scale farmers is still belonging to the state, which means that coming out the gate, smaller scale farmers have a very different expectations, certainty, rights, and also responsibilities to older segments of the market. Again, this is one of those sort of big unfairnesses in terms of the rules of the game that is holding us back from having a more competitive internally and externally marketplace. Maybe you just want to touch on that, because obviously that's one of those issues that everybody's interested in. I know we had another conversation about this, but let's just touch on that point briefly around the ownership rights question and why that is so important for developing the less developed strata of our agricultural economy.
Yeah, I think, Brian, it's very important you raise that, because I don't want people to think, okay, this is the book that is, again, talking about black, white, farmer, small, big, all of that. Because the book is about how do we grow the South African agricultural pie in a more sustainable way, which then is at the heart of the point you're making. Because at the end of the day, moving one land parcel from a white farmer to a black farmer, sure, you deal with the racial inequities that are there. But the point is, you are not really adding a lot on the table to address the unemployment, to address the poverty and all of these things. Then the first question that one has is to say, are there other avenues at which we can grow, which is where then we're saying there's more land outside, that over 2 million hectares that can come into production. That is where growing the South African agricultural pie, the point we discussed about the skills that are necessary, training and making sure that the folks that are getting into that land, they have those right requisite skills. And in addition to that, then the infrastructure, working municipalities, financing, all of those, they get to be a beneficiary, linking to export markets. They get to be a beneficiary to help us to grow that sector on that. And I mean, you have two points. It's either you are going to give the folks title deeds, or we have to have long-term tradable leases. That is very important, because we are here now. The markets are the way they are. The financing is the way that it is. We have poverty today. And we have to be saying, how do we operate while all other things are still negotiated to be changing? And for me, what was encouraging is that having conversation with the sitting Minister of Agriculture, Ms. Togo Didiza, and the others all the way to the Union Building, I do think that there is a much more appetite at the moment to actually move to the release of that land with title deeds, actually get things to change than the policy dynamics that we were discussing. And as that is happening, it doesn't mean land reform is off the table. It is on the table. But then again, it has to be done in a sustainable and a better way. And which is where then our previous conversation, we did talk about what are some of those options are. So that's why I still think, the issue of property rights and how much that needs to be protected, because at the end of the day, we're a capital intensive farming sector in South Africa. Just thinking about the farm debt this year, as we talk in 2023, the South African farm debt is around about 200 billion rands, which also just shows you then that, unfortunately, that's not the money that they've been piling and not paying it back. That's the money that they've been getting to actually reinvest in the sector and leading to all of the gains that we talk about, but are still now largely on the one side. And we want that to grow in a more equitable way going forward.
Absolutely, of course. Certainty is critical for investment. And when it comes to agriculture, it is massive investment, as you've said. And these are long-term commitments that farmers are expected, anyone that's expected to engage in these sorts of projects is supposed to commit to. And without certainty over what land rights and responsibilities will be in place, not just a couple of months from now, but decades and generations from now, is definitely going to hold us back. And that's why, to kind of sum up the kind of opportunity going ahead, is that if we are looking for growth, if we are looking to get out of poverty spirals, if we want to take advantage of the economy and our natural endowments that we really do have in this part of the world, like redistribution might be a necessary conversation. And that is just getting towards a more equitable distribution of opportunity, of rules of justice in our country. But it is not sufficient when it comes to growth and taking advantage of opportunity. And that brings us to like probably the most critical part of your book, which is, of course, the issue of the opportunity in this sector. So now we can take our eyes around or away from our domestic problems and drama and towards the greater global opportunity. And you spend quite a lot of the pages in your book looking at the opportunity for growth and how that is one of the few opportunities for growth that's actually realistic and practical that we can take advantage of right now with what we have in order to actually get some vital lifeblood flowing into our economy, but how critical it is to get our export market right when it comes to taking advantage of that growth. And we've already covered the point for the people who say that we shouldn't be exporting because we don't have food security here, that in fact, we do have enough food. The problem is, again, a distribution problem here locally. It's not a supply problem, but the opportunity is very much to grow beyond our borders through forming alliances, through forming partnerships, and through essentially playing nice with people, not just across the African continent, but across both the BRICS and the Washington Consensus world. So maybe you can start by sort of outlining the opportunity as you see it. And then you can also cover the point of where we are dropping the ball, where we are leaving low-hanging fruit on the branches.
Yeah. I like that term, low-hanging fruit on the branches. I think, Rod, the challenge that we have, I mean, at the moment in South Africa, we are exporting about half of what we produce in value terms. So we've done reasonably well. I mean, 40% goes to Africa. You have another 25% into the EU, 7% the UK, and then you have another distributed across the Middle East, Americas, and elsewhere. So we are nicely diversified. And within the African continent, in every 1 rand of our agricultural exports to Africa, 90 cents of it is within the SADC region. So we're not as big in the other parts of the world. I mean, people, when they read the book, they will see that I'm not as optimistic about the gains of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement from an agricultural perspective for the near term. Maybe after a decade, when infrastructure, harmonization of the standards, and many other things are in place, we may begin to see that, as well as incomes improving in a number of countries. Because where South Africa's advantage lies on, and where the expansion will be, firstly from a production perspective, we'll expand a lot on value chains around livestock, cattle farming, sheep farming, and all of that. That's where there is also going to be a large part of growth in South Africa and the commercialization. And in addition to that, there is going to be expansion on the fruit side, which is high value fruits, and vegetables, and all of that is largely going to be for export markets. Likewise with the livestock for export markets. There may be improvement in the grain and the other field crops, but not so much on that. And wine industry is also one of those that is very important. So when we interface with the world to say we want exports, what we promote a lot as South Africa is livestock at the moment, beef farming, beef products, and our fruits, our vegetables, and our wine. That's the stuff that we will see a bit more growth in demand for in the world market. And the areas that we want for expansion of growth, I mean, we are increasingly now having a lot of problems in the EU. With farm to fork strategy as part of the Green Deal, the standards are changing. We get told what products we should be utilizing on as our inputs on our production and all kinds of things, which some is reasonable, but some they negatively affect our productivity. So we are looking at saying, can we perhaps maybe be growing our export markets more in Asia and elsewhere in the Middle East? Which is why when we're talking with BRICS, countries like India as well as China are so important for us, because BRICS alone is a big market that is about $320 billion of agricultural imports, and 85% of that is within China and India. And at the moment, South Africa is not getting a lot from BRICS. BRICS accounts for about 8% of our exports, almost similar to the UK, which is about 7%. So we are thinking about how do you broaden that? And when you consider the new additions of countries in the BRICS, there's Saudi Arabia, to an extent that when I looked at it and I looked on a net basis with everything else from an agricultural perspective, I was like, okay, this is a positive for South Africa because this is where we will be growing. And when we think about bringing all of that land into production, it does mean that we have to be looking for countries to send those products to. Otherwise, we'll have profitability challenges in the farming sector, which then plays negatively for the jobs and everything else that we want in those communities. That's why then the story of exports gets to be so important, and the Middle East is also important on that. But at the same time, it means that the logistics infrastructure has to be better. Fighting rural crime is something that needs to be fought, because the stock theft, people think crime is only affecting, it's all over rural South Africa. It's a very big problem on that, as well as making sure that our infrastructure operates at the ports, the railway line, the roads are in order, because all of these things are perishable, high value products, and they need to be moved to the export markets in an efficient and cost effective way. And these are all of the aspects that I think when policymakers are looking at the sector and community leaders and business leaders, they need to be cognizant of saying, how do we structure all of these better? And I think the Eastern Cape, KZN, Limpopo are what in the book we even call the growth frontiers of the South African agricultural sector, because that is where there's more land, that is where also there's poverty and all of these social difficulties, which is why I tend to say intensifying the value chains, the agriculture there, and adding value addition in some of the value chains in those areas will have a much more better positive spin-offs that will help us to deal with the challenges. So that's how we see growth as well as, and I think as we intensify the BRICS, we should not underestimate the gains we are getting in the EU, regardless of the problems that we continuously face with the Green Deal and in the US and elsewhere, because you have to manage those relationships and the African continent, even though we are thinking about broadening the export markets to other areas. So it's a very careful way, and our trade authorities have to be walking that line quite carefully.
Well, you've clearly articulated the opportunity there, but what about some of the threats, particularly from a geopolitical perspective or realpolitik perspective? Let's just talk about the sort of brass tacks and the sort of elephants in the room here once again. Whereas, do you foresee challenges to South Africa's export market with regards to essentially our geopolitical stance as a country? Are we going to have to choose between deepening relations, like you suggest, with BRICS, which is very small at the moment, which means it's a risk, but it's also a potential long-term partnership that could be very lucrative for us? Or are we going to be able to do that and maintain deep ties with the likes of the US and the EU and the various Commonwealth countries? Or do you foresee, given the way global politics is falling out at the moment with the wars and rumors of wars and the various different mishaps and tantrums on various planes, on various runways that have gone on, will we have to make a choice? And if we do have to make a choice, in your view, that is going to be something that we need to put onto our scenario maps, what is the side that you would suggest that we should choose if we are forced into that sort of corner of picking A versus B?
From purely an economic point of view, you're still winning with the old school that is in there. To be honest, you still want to sit with the EU, sit with the US, sit with the broader African continent, because you cannot put all your eggs on BRICS. I chaired the agribusiness working group of BRICS within South Africa, and this year also globally. So it pains me to say that BRICS is not that significant on our agricultural trade at the moment. They make up 8%, and there is no guarantee about how much they can actually be able to absorb. You cannot divert all of that which goes to the EU to the BRICS countries. So the better point is actually to ensure that the current relationships you have with the EU and you have with the US and you have with the African continent, those remain firm, and you are able to keep those markets in, while at the same time then playing a very careful geopolitical angle on making sure that you continue to maintain friendship with the BRICS countries, friendship with the broader Middle East countries, so that you can expand and grow over time in that road. So this should be a way of peaceful coexistence, should actually be a way at which you strive to be sitting on. So the world may be changing around you as South Africa, but you should try to have a peaceful coexistence with all of these world. Otherwise, you are in a very dangerous territory. And in agriculture, it's even more exposed, which is why farmers were talking a lot when we were approaching all of these things about AGOA. Because at the end of the day, we've made the point together that South Africa exports about half of what it produces. And any reduction in that volume, it hurts on the margins, because the margins in farming are already very thin. So we do need that those export markets. So you need a peaceful coexistence and really dance that. I think choosing too much of the sides, and we need to have a careful path on the geopolitics. Because on an economic point of view, it's a dangerous route. There are other issues of morality and other things. It's for other people who are qualified to speak on those. But I think from an economic side, you have to balance.
Well, you make a very good point there. The point is that we're not a geopolitical superpower in the world, and that if we're going to be smart and look after our own people, as is our mandate, not from a nationalistic point of view, but from a very practical point of view, we've got mouths to feed, we've got problems to solve here. What we should be focusing on is building new bridges rather than burning old alliances, right? So the more bridges we can build, the better position we'll be in. And that means playing nice and perhaps sitting out of fights that are none of our business, unless we want to make enemies that we can't afford.
Absolutely.
Well, that's all of my questions that I have for you. So to wrap this up, if you've got any closing comments, go for it. Otherwise, tell people where they can find you, where they can find your book, where they can engage with you if they want to continue this conversation at a professional level.
Yeah, they can engage with me on Twitter. I'm super professional there. Wandile Sihlobo. On the more, so I do think that the folks can find me on all social networks, and you can email us. All our details are on the website of our organization, which is www.agbiz.co.za. The book, which is an important part of all of this, is available in all bookstores across South Africa and on the ebook platforms, A Country of Two Agricultures. And I hope folks do enjoy the book.
Yeah, and if you do enjoy the book, do the right thing, leave a review, comment on it for someone else. All these things don't cost you anything. They make a very big difference to people who are putting their ideas out there, which is hard work. And thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, not just with us today, but also committing to the job of writing them down and sharing them with the rest of our country and the world at large. Thank you so much, Wandile. It's been fantastic as always.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and rate us on all your preferred podcast platforms. If you'd like to find out more about what we're doing, please join our Substack community via the link in the comments below. And as always, we'd love to hear your suggestions for future guests and conversation topics.